Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast of Housing Geospatial, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything that relates to either housing or geospatial, preferably if there's a little bit of both. Housing Geospatial was formed as we believe place matters for social housing and that geospatial information is woefully underrepresented within the housing sector. This is around sharing a collective knowledge within the housing sector. You can either find us on LinkedIn or feel free to head on over to our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. I am your host, Chris Kinnear, and our guest for this podcast is the ever insightful Yogeta Partridge, who is the founder at Rydeo Consulting. Hi, Yogeta.
Hi, Chris.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us today. So, first of all, how are you involved in either housing or geospatial?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me, and thanks for that very kind introduction. And the phrase has been used quite a lot lately, but I fell into housing. Housing wasn't a career of choice, albeit that may change with time based on all the campaigns that are out there at the minute. So, background for me is a solicitor by trade. I came into the housing sector through working at a law firm doing property charging, all that exciting stuff where you use property to secure debt. And I was there for about 3 years, give or take, and I got an opportunity to second to L&Q for 6 months. And one of the things that I kind of outside inside looking, and my job for those 6 months was to streamline the process of that property charge, make things a lot easier, and try and speed things up. So outside looking in, sure, no problem. All we need to do is collate some documents and put some processes in place, job done. So by about month 2, probably even earlier than that, I realised that wasn't going to be the case at all. And what I did find was some of the basic questions at the time. And so we're going back to about 2008, I think, when I stepped in, 2008, 2009. So a very long time ago by today's standards. But I realised that actually, A, nobody really talked about property charging. B, the legal ownership aspect of things, that was my starting point when I opened dialogue. It was left to the lawyers. It was assumed that the law firms not assumed, the law firms were tasked with that legal bit. And internally, the assumption was they would just do it, and it was done. So rather than the 6 months of comment, that converts into a 13-year career, which may sound astounding when you think, crikey, it took 13 years to do that. It didn't. I can assure you it didn't. I did a lot more than just streamline procedures. And actually, what I did do was I spent a lot of time putting property charging on the map. Because nobody talked about it, because it was a tag end of a treasury role, because actually, to my mind, it isn't rocket science. There's some really quick wins, some easy wins. All it needs is some expertise, buy-in from senior management, and just some streamlining along with some knowledge, which sounds really straightforward. But actually, nobody really appreciated the challenges that come with that end transaction, and also the question as to why it takes so long for that end transaction to happen and why there's so many delays. And anyone that's listened to the podcast that's ever had to do a property charging exercise will either eye roll or sigh in the housing sector, because it's just always been so challenging. When you think back to 2009, and the reason I joined, quite a simple transaction was taking 2 years, which wasn't unheard of in the sector. So I suppose my housing and then therefore geospatial link would come when, this is of course where you and I crossed paths, Chris, was so my vision at the time, and what I would call the perfect visual piece, was to be able to know what L&Q owned on a map. And for those again, listen to the podcast who have seen the Land Registry map search, it's a bit like that. Those that haven't, feel free to have a look at it, but you'll get the idea. It's redlining, and it's kind of the bits of land that matter in housing garages, because what there's a challenge with this legal jargon space, and there's a challenge around translating it into very, very simple, easy to use visual maps, to my mind. And I am no expert in geospatial, complete disclaimer. But from a what would be really helpful from an organizational perspective would be an accurate and up-to-date visual map where you can drill into some of those details, but not just legal ownership. There is so much more. When I think about, and we'll probably come on to this later, but when I think about that property aspect, so from a housing sector perspective, there's a real heavy focus on customer, quite rightly, and also the property. But the two sit kind of under the umbrella of the organisation. So to my mind, the fundamental aspect of the property bit should be, let's start with the bare basics of, do you know what you own? Which sounds really straightforward, but when we think about an organisation that has lots of subsidiaries, when we think about land ownership, when we think about actually I'm going to transfer it to this entity and that entity is going to sell it to that, and that's going to develop here, that starts to get complex. And you run the risk that, if you don't understand some of those structures and you don't have transparency at exec level and at board level, then how on earth are we functioning as a business that's acting in the best interest of our customer? Sorry, I'm waffling on a bit, aren't I, here? So that's housing and that's geospatial. And yes, I suppose to answer that question very short and simply, yes, that's how I was involved.
But that brings us really neatly on to our second one. I mean, we'll talk about ownership and the geospatial side later on. But you founded Rydeo Consulting 2 years ago. Can you tell us about the journey of why you founded it and how it's been since then and everything else?
Yeah, no, of course. So I talked about being at L&Q for 13 years, and whilst I was at L&Q, and I set up these working groups. And again, for anyone listening, there's a legal treasury group that I set up under the umbrella of the NHF, and that is for anyone who has anything to do with property charging. Don't have to be qualified. You can just turn up at the group. And the chair at the moment is Keely Henderson, who is head of property treasury at Riverside Group. So do drop her a line if you would like to attend the group. It doesn't cost anything. I think they meet quarterly, but I set that up all those years ago, as I said, because nobody talked about property charging, but actually there was an opportunity to share best practice, have those conversations around, I find this really, really challenging, but actually be able to bounce off others and share and use that expertise of others in a forum where no one's sharing anything commercial. And then connected but separate to that was a property finance working group, where actually the legal treasury group would come up with the challenges. Is there an opportunity for the property finance working group, which is made up of the lawyers, the valuers, which I also chaired. I kicked them off in 2014, so I was leading them and chairing both those groups for a while, and actually having that connectivity was helpful, because we then came up with the standard form certificate of title. We then also did the 2 versions, as it ended up being, of the Section 106 Mortgage Protection Clause. So a couple of really useful outcomes from both working groups. So definitely recommend, if anyone's interested in kind of talking, so I suppose involved with property charging and feel like they're on their own, you're not. That's why I set up the Legal Treasury Group. So Rydeo Consulting came out because a number of the conversations that would openly happen would be, we are struggling to recruit somebody that does what you do. We just need lots of you in every organisation, and therefore we'll be fine, and we can be able to do things a lot more efficient and at a quicker rate. Yeah. So what I did with Rydeo Consulting was, I thought, okay, how I can't, and at the time I was at L&Q, I couldn't go into every organisation, but I acknowledged that there was a gap. But I also stopped and thought, hang on, whilst we're talking about the property charging piece, that's the end bit. And one of the things that I did over my years in sector to date is that I've always talked about your reactive space of your transactionals, your reactive space of your transactional part. If that's not going well, how do you understand what that challenge is so you can proactively fix it? And this kind of goes back a little bit to what I was talking about. And you start with, okay, customer property, right? Okay, under my properties, which is the focus that I do through Rydeo Consulting, is do you know what you own? Let's start with the bare basics. Do you know what you own? Is it accurate and reliable? So as part of what I was doing at L&Q, I fell into the concept of the assets and liabilities register, which is now a regulatory requirement. The challenge, I think, with the sector at the minute is that, is it a challenge? It's a question, maybe, is it acknowledged enough that starting with that foundation, and there isn't a solution for it, as I found out within L&Q, and we end up building our own, but we'll probably come on to that later. But what is that starting point upon which you can then build those robust foundations? And then you kind of go, okay, here's my robust foundation. Let's use the analogy of a tree. Random, but let's do it. Fitting gardening in there, it's great, isn't it? So there's, there's that concept of a visually, you've kind of got the tree that's the really strong trunk, that's all your, up-to-date and reliable data. It tells you all your obligations. It tells you, your lease expiry terms. It tells you, have I got ongoing obligations? My Section 106, what are they? Have they been complied with? Who's monitoring that? So there's a whole host of information in that tree trunk, upon which you've then got your branches, which end up being your strategies, your asset management strategy, development strategy, finance strategy, treasury, whatever that may be. I'm sure there'll be people on the others on the podcast who hate that analogy, but dress it up how you will. To my point is, it's around those robust foundations and really getting to grips with your asset as an asset. So back to the question, Rydeo Consulting for me is just me at the moment. And I work with organisations, work with housing associations because of that skills and expertise gap. And there isn't another advisor in the sector that does what I do. Because I'm able to be a hands-on resource from a property charging perspective because I've been doing it for so long, but I also acknowledge the problem internally and able to, because I did this at L&Q and I've talked about it so often, is breaking down the silos internally to create a thread that runs through the life cycle of the home. So you start with your legal ownership, but that isn't everything. There are so many other aspects to each and every individual unit. How do you bring that together? But how do you bring that together so that it's robustly governed? And to my mind, there is a better chance of being able to anticipate some of these challenges before they turn into something a lot bigger.
So that is really cool. And the fact that you can also support landlords from a fundamental operational point of view with the work all the way through to that strategy. I think, like you said, I don't think there's probably, like you said, there's no one else in the sector doing that sort of thing, is there?
Don't think there is. The podcast might tell me otherwise, though.
No, that's good if there is, but yeah. So we're talking about ownership.
Yeah.
Do you think the sector has a good enough grasp of what it owns and what it's responsible for?
Put me on the spot. Interesting. So when my oblivious outside looking inside thought it was all nailed, and of course you'd know, turned into oh my goodness, nobody really knows the version of the truth, one source of truth, all that sort of stuff. Back in 2008, and now I feel like we've come a long way, but we are far from there yet. I think from an ownership perspective, there are bits of software out there that people could use. I mean, you've got the Land Registry API. There's lots of different things that can be done with data without going down the rabbit hole of data, of course. But it's connecting it to all these various different systems that every organization has internally. and finding something that's going to connect neatly and succinctly and isn't just another bit of software, isn't yet another silo system, is really, really challenging. And it takes the need to invest. There's a difference. What I often talk about is don't waste cost on some of this stuff. Treat it as an investment. So to be able to provide that transparency, for example, it's how is that going to be an investment as opposed to a wasted cost? What is it about it that makes, how are you going to make sure that if it is a bit of software or if it is somebody carrying out some work for you, how is that an investment in creating those robust foundations? From an obligations perspective, again, I've alluded to it a bit earlier on. We're talking about obligations kind of from the property itself. So we're talking about restrictions, we're talking about are there planning conditions, are there planning obligations? So when we put that into the perspective of the operational aspects of things, when you're trying to, let's say, dispose of a property, let's say you're trying to even borrow against a property, let's say you're trying to either sell or lease, which comes under disposal anyway. But all of those restrictions and planning obligations matter to that end bit of work, to that transaction. So it's how do you have that transparency? You are better able to anticipate what that looks like. So I suppose to answer your question, I think the sector's getting better, but I think there's still a long journey to go. I think there are more conversations happening about it. There are more people like me who are quite open about this critical need to really invest in knowing your homes, not just stock condition surveys, so much more than that. And I think exec and boards are hearing it. The regulator's certainly on board, but the regulator isn't going to be exhaustive to say this is what you should do, because not the assumption, but when we think about that assets and liabilities regulatory requirement, okay, yes, that is a regulatory requirement, but just as a basic business function, a basic, how do you run your business? Knowing that ownership and understanding of property obligations, not sat with your lawyer in a folder somewhere, not sat, in a spreadsheet or a what's the word? One of those portals. That's a ticket. One of those portals. But actually, it's the fundamental aspects of how you make your informed decisions.
So it sounds like, please correct me if I'm kind of wrong with assuming this, but it sounds like the sector sort of takes an assumption that a legal team has it under wraps. The legal team might not have it under wraps, or at least the information is siloed away within an individual or a team, and it's not shared or democratized effectively within an organization.
Yeah, I suppose that is a part of it, but there's also who's checking. Who's checking? Who's checking whether it's right? Who's checking whether it's accurate, up to date? Who has the expertise to do that?
Okay, so that's a really interesting point, the who's checking. So it's like you've kind of glossed very quickly over some of the benefits. What are kind of like a few reasons why you should understand your ownership and your property charging, your obligations and things like that? What kind of frontline services and also your regulatory reporting, but what does that kind of support?
So, good question. So I've talked about kind of the disposals, the sales, the leases. So let's go through this then. Let's do asset management strategy as an example. Portfolio of properties, either to stock transfer and or dispose of. How are you confident that the value that you've attributed to those accurately acknowledges perhaps whether there are any restrictions and or planning obligations, when we think about development strategies, are we making best use of the land that hang on, let me rephrase that. Are we optimizing the opportunity to its maximum? I.e., if you've got a bit of land here and you've got a bit of land over here, let's say it's someone that does have land ownership, or you have a block of garages here and you have another garage site over here. Actually, if there's somebody in the middle that owns it that actually you can work in partnership with, are you optimizing those opportunities to collaborate to build more homes? Or are you not aware and therefore not able to maximize new partnerships and or new homes? From a Treasury perspective, it's a little more black and white, because if you don't own it, you can't borrow against it, which unfortunately still happens. Those last minute, oh, you don't own this anymore, you can't charge it. Because things evolve over time, unless you've got an accurate and reliable database at the proactive end, these things will evolve over time and no one's keeping track of it, and there is a risk that you therefore can't use it as security, which triggers other issues, because why is it on your system? And there are other consequences to that. You know, are you charging your tenants? What's happened there? And that's a whole host of unraveling that comes out. But let's think about the housing teams at the front. Get a phone call from a customer or resident saying, fence has fallen down, you need to come and fix it. Is it your fence to fix? And I appreciate that often it would be, sure, we'll just do it, but having that transparency would be helpful. And then I suppose let's look at grounds maintenance. You're maintaining some grounds. Do you actually even own those grounds to maintain it? Or is it just, we've always done it and therefore we're going to keep doing it, even though it's not yours to maintain, it's a completely different legal ownership. So I think pretty much, and I suppose, yeah, then of course from the governance perspective, it's the assets and liabilities register. So I think to my mind, I think just understanding the ownership and having that accurate and reliable data source, plus the layering of information above it's your obligations, your restrictions, so on and so forth, I think is critical to pretty much every department in the organization.
That's one thing that you've just reminded me of how you can't borrow against if you don't know you own it, sort of thing. I heard a story of a landlord who got a call from a resident one day and said, oh, I need you to come and fix my tap. And they're like, your home's not on our system. Turns out they actually owned it, and it was in a very wealthy bit of London.
Oh, yeah,
So
that's the bit that I didn't talk about. Yeah, absolutely. You've got to know what you own because you don't know what you don't own, right?
yeah,
Absolutely.
so I mean, it's quite a big challenge, it sounds like. You talked very quickly about some of the quick wins.
Mhm.
So before we go on to we'll talk about what you did at L&Q in a bit, but what are kind of some of the solutions that housing associations could do, like from tomorrow sort of thing, that would have not necessarily a relatively quick impact, but like what are the things they could take the steps to do
Yeah.
to achieve this?
No, I hear you. You know, whenever I'm approached with questions like that, I have a list of questions that I say take that internally and ask it. And if you can get answers to all of those questions, then you're one of very few who can sleep well. But it's simple things, like it's asking those questions. Don't be afraid to ask those questions. There could be somebody in your organization that is already talking about this sort of stuff. Is that connected? Are those dots connected? What is the exec and board's direction in terms of this legal ownership piece? When they're signing off financial statements and saying, yes, we have an accurate and up-to-date assets and liabilities register as part of the regulatory requirements. Do you? Are you asking the right questions? who controls that? So again, there are quite a few connected questions that pose those, and it's almost that internal review. But it's okay it's important to ask those questions, and I think every organization, I know every organization should be asking those questions, because it's important for each organization and sector wide that you are asking questions that may be a little bit uncomfortable, that aren't glossed over, that aren't ignored, and about investing, as I said, investing and not wasting cost on things that don't connect. But yeah, I think the senior buying's critical, because you could have somebody sat in a department, whether it's treasury or asset management, it doesn't matter where it is, who is screaming at the top of their lungs that things need to change. But unless this has senior management buy-in all the way from exec down, there's a risk that it just doesn't happen. And I say legal and regulatory requirements are just one of many reasons to do it.
Okay. So the first stage, it seems like, do an internal review, almost like an internal audit, get you kind of your baseline, where are we at with understanding our information? Let's say we're an organization which doesn't necessarily know everything. We know some bits and bobs. We're pretty confident that what we have, we own, but we don't know much else. What other steps could we take to further our understanding or be in a better place at least?
So there's a couple of options. So with the things that you know, is it kept up to date and accurate and reliable? So if it is, great, you just need to add to that. How can you add to that? Well, it depends on how you're managing that at the minute. Are you going to lawyers saying, please can you do, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying for a second that that this process doesn't work, but it goes to my point around wasted cost and converting that, changing that into an investment. So if you're going to lawyers saying, right, can you tell me everything I own? Great. But with an land registry, it's a snapshot in time. So it's how do you keep that up to date and accurate? Land registry APIs. There are software pieces out there that can contribute to that. But again, it goes to the same question around, and most organizations, say it slowly, say it properly. Most organizations will have a data transformation team potentially, and or somebody looking at data. Is that part of the conversation? Is this thinking part of the broader strategic, how do we transform our data into something that's useful for us as an organization? And how do we add to that? So it isn't just about the data, it's how do we make sure that for every new scheme that we do, okay, so we've covered our existing stuff. How do you make sure going forward we've embedded the processes and procedures so that we don't have to keep spending this amount to just keep doing it every time? It's how do we stop that rolling gap of data and information and knowledge on our properties continuing?
I think that segues on quite nicely, especially that last point, that don't repeatedly do the same things. So when you were at L&Q, you began, designed and implemented the ownership project. And I was very fortunate that I had a small role within that of visualizing the ownership information. Can you tell us a bit more about that, kind of from beginning, middle and end sort of thing?
Yeah. So it was more than a little bit you played, just to say. It was a much bigger bit. I'll come on to that. But it was, as I say, so I stepped in and realised actually nobody tracked the title numbers, and therefore didn't know what they owned. And I say this goes back to 2008, so I'm not, I don't believe I'm upsetting anyone by saying that. But it took a while because nobody talked about land registry legal ownership over the years as you should know what you own internally. And let's go back before assets and liabilities register, which is where I started the conversations across the sector, not just L&Q. And the continual challenge that I kept hearing in the working groups was and the continuing issues with property charging transactions was we don't own it and we just have to drop things, but you've wasted X amount on legal fees for someone else to tell you that you don't own it. So they've pulled down the land registry documents and you've paid for that particular or those particular sets of properties to be put into charge, and it's a wasted cost because the law firms expect us, quite rightly, as organisations to know what we own. So if you give them a list of properties, the assumption is that you own all of them. So it was really and truly only after, and actually the assets and liabilities register conversation was quite a nice way of highlighting why it was so important that everybody knows what they own. But it wasn't at first met with, yeah, sure, let's get on with this. There were some question marks over the cost of doing something like this, but also the lack of, and at the time it was a lack of anything out there that provided this. So there wasn't that software solution out there that could fix this. Of course, now there are a lot more, but it's how do we make this so that the housing management system, at the click of a button, somebody can click on it and go, okay, so we own that property and . Some of the challenges that I found when I was going through this, and again, others listening to the podcast may appreciate this, is which title number are we storing? And actually, if there are complex arrangements, such as actually in the freehold, actually also in the leasehold, has a hierarchy sit of titles. So if we're going, okay, we own a freehold, the leasehold sits underneath. The leasehold's owned by, I don't know, a different entity. So it took a lot of unraveling. And the buy-in was eventually brought in, but only because I emphasised the legal and regulatory requirement of getting this done. And often an IDA can spur that, right, okay, we just need to just get this done. Generally, across the sector, it's often right, okay, what do we need to do quickly? But it's anticipating that. So within L&Q, again, there wasn't a solution there, so we had to start from scratch and we had to build something in-house. And I was very, very lucky that the team that I worked with at L&Q were brilliant, of which you were one, so thank you. And you were also, and again, within that team that supported the creation of it and built it, again, the vision for me, and this is where you and I spent hours talking, which was, I just want to see it on a map. That's all I want. I just want to see what we own on a map. And, and I remember the challenges that you and I would talk about from a geospatial perspective. I am no geospatial expert, but just leaning on you in terms of what does that mean for L&Q as an organisation, that was not easy. And all sorts of conundrums would come up and so on and so forth, and certain things and other challenges. So when we think about, so very long story short, we did create something, and the idea was that we would target the homes with residents first, absolutely, and make sure and everything's spot on that front. But this isn't just things that are on the housing management database. Is there anything else we haven't thought about? So when I first undertook this project, there were 15,000 titles to go through that L&Q had, which is a lot. But over time, that was that snapshot in time. And again, even the land registry weren't quite where they are now with this, because when I talked to the land registry about this, they'd only just started what was called a property portfolio consolidator as a concept, and they were in the very early stages of trying to run some of the things that they do a lot quicker now, and things have come a long way. So I suppose to wrap that up, we built something within L&Q that I believe still goes. I'm not there, I don't know, but I handed it over before I left. And but again, it's and actually what it does require, which is my point around it, is that it was handed over to somebody who has the knowledge of the land registry and can therefore verify when anything new comes in, can match that up, because of course there's a gap between practical completion and when it's registered at the land registry. So there's always going to be a little bit of a gap, but it just needs to make sure that somebody's able to verify it going forward. So it wasn't the fanciest of systems, but it did the job. But untangling Spaghetti Junction data-wise was interesting, and I now know what an MVP is.
I think, yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things from when I was working with you. I think the first thing that astounded me was how much L&Q was spending just on title documents every year.
Yeah.
I think, I don't want to say the number in case I get it wrong.
It was a lot.
Are you able? Yeah,
It was a lot.
it's in the tens of thousands. And it was insane. Like, coming from like a teaching background where we were like scavenging for pens and books, to hearing, you know, we to say like, oh, land registry titles are only £3 each, but you have to be buying an awful amount of them to be spending the amount they were. And so one of the things that I really loved with this project was the fact that we had our geospace, we had our coordinates for every home, and we connected it up to our housing management system, and you could go, okay, this property here within that, when we fed the information back out, has got this title number. This is the freehold, this is the leasehold. And that was so useful. And I think that's an instant benefit for frontline staff and for treasury teams and legal teams, that they can just go onto this map and see it straight away. The other thing that I found really interesting was when we were going through the information, is there was a stock exchange years before. I don't know if you remember this one, but it was 2 blocks, and L&Q originally owned the 2. But then at one point it was an old subsidiary that L&Q kind of split into 2. One half of it went to L&Q, one of it became something else. But the land registry still said L&Q owned both of them. And so it was a really, like you said, understanding what you own and looking at that information. Just because you've gone to the one-stop shop of land registry doesn't necessarily mean that's fully correct. And that was one of our colleagues, I think, who identified that one.
Yeah, and I suppose so. 2 things on that, and you're absolutely right. I think the L&Q, when we talk about the cost of land registry documentation, to be fair, it isn't just L&Q, it's the sector. And what it came down to was that governance on things like who has access to the land registry and why are they accessing it. It was who needs access to the land registry, right? Okay, and this is sector wide. And when I've gone into various organisations, it's frequently the person in development that is the responsible person, who shouldn't be the responsible person, if I'm honest. It should be someone in governance and or legal, who is able to accurately control the purposes and what it's used for. And those that have access shouldn't be sharing usernames and passwords, but those that are using it, and it's put somewhere safe. As I say, with things like title register documents and title plans, it's a snapshot in time. Whereas things like leases and transfers and conveyance is different, because they stay with the land until such time as if it's a leasehold, it's determined. But that runs with the land, so they are definitely worth keeping. But your title registers are just an example of the register at that date and time, hence has a date and time at the top. And there was so there was something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten what it is now, so clearly not that important. But no, you played please don't underplay your part. You did a miraculous job. Putting up with me, and B, getting it right.
But I think you're right, that just the sheer coming from a mapping point, just visualizing your ownership. One of the things we did that was really simple was we took our polygons that we knew, and we knew our coordinates were accurate. So we just said, okay, what's in the polygons and what's outside the polygons? And that threw up loads of questions. And like, that was really simple. And I think for me, one of the kind of key takeaways of this is, it's a bit of an investment. You've got to really be in that mindset as an organization to want to do this. But once you do that, you'll save in efficiencies because you're not spending loads on buying title information or having to reference 20 other things or two different teams or having to pay a lawyer to find that information out for you. Your frontline staff, like how you built that into the housing management system at L&Q, that was just a tab. So you looked at the property and there was an ownership tab. And there you could say leasehold 26 years or 200 years or whatever the number was. So that became really simple for frontline staff and managers to understand. And so, yeah, keep it simple, make it so people can use it, make it accessible. Like you said, there's so many organizations which don't make it accessible.
Yeah.
And I did have another one as well. Oh gosh, I got all excited talking about maps. Are there any other kind of takeaways that you think housing associations could take away from what we've been chatting about today?
Just before I do, I remember my other point, the accuracy of the land registry. It is as accurate as it can be because it's the only source of truth. And it's only as good as the applications that go in. It's not perfect, but it's the only version of the truth. So that is the one to rely on. So that was the only bit I was going to make. In terms of takeaways, you know, my intention isn't to be doom and gloom on any of this. My intention is to instill and support the proactive approach to how do we tackle this property bit of these two pods that we need to, you know, really enforce and strengthen. And there is a lot that goes into the customer aspect. I just feel like we could do more as a sector and individuals, organisations in that property bit, and every organisation is at a different stage. And I'm comforted and pleased. You know, the intention here is to go and have those conversations internally. If you need some questions, drop me a line, and I will send you some questions that you can take away and ask internally. And because to me it's about being clear and understanding what it is that is going on internally for you to then be able to solve it and treat it as an investment and not as a wasted cost. But yes, my intention isn't to be doom and gloom, and apologies if anyone feels like I have been. Wasn't my intention.
I don't think so particularly. I think it's been quite a realistic understanding. Like I remember, and I've seen some other organisations' ownership data, and that's, yeah, some of them have it. Some organisations have it really well, some not so much. So I don't think it's necessarily doom and gloom. But you're right. I think there's a really positive outcome that housing associations get. When we had Justin Chamberlain on a few weeks ago, one of the things he said was he just found bits of land where there were no homes, which he knew he could sell off, and they made something like $250,000 within a year or something.
Perfect.
Really great simple example. Understanding. You know. And I've got one last question. It's kind of become my last question kind of one now. But if you kind of had an unlimited budget, and I don't know whether it's from a Rydeo perspective or from a single organisation perspective, and I'll leave that one up to you. But if you had an unlimited budget, what kind of project do you think you'd develop? Just on kind of, if you had loads of money, what would you do kind of as a project?
And this is what I'd do it from a sector-wide perspective, actually. And I would, if I could, I don't know if it's a case of turning back time or starting from scratch, but there are so many different versions of housing management systems out there, but all associations do the same thing, give or take. And when it comes to properties and residents, there'll be some standard fields that are there. And I know there's talk about, you know, standardizing data and so forth, but I see this slightly differently. I see this as okay, we're sitting here now saying property customer, let's get all of this expertise together, and how do we create something that every organization, and you know, this is kind of blue sky thinking in a perfect world, but how do you create something that is robust in itself, so has the legal ownership, has the obligations, has all of the bits that matter from a property perspective, then also from a customer perspective, but integrate the two, and the accuracy and reliability is already fed into it. See, this is the perfect world thinking, Chris. And and thank God I've got an unlimited budget to do it. And it's about it's right. We all, when we talk about the housing sector, but there are so many different little bits and bobs of silo systems sitting there that, to my mind, and I know it's not the software solution that I'm trying to drive at. It's actually just understanding and having that broader understanding of everything in one place. Because organisations will always have a development team, asset management team, finance team, treasury team. So there are some opportunities there to kind of connect all of that and just create something that works and does all the detail. Because think how long the housing sector's been around for and how it started. Well, the intention was, okay, the homes are here. We're now going to focus on this bit. So not enough time, to my mind, has been spent and/or innovative thinking has was done back then, and it's evolved over time. So to me, it'd be fix this bit down here, so this bit becomes nice and straightforward and pleasant. But yeah, that's just me.
I think that is a lovely bit of optimism to create systemic understanding of homes and people.
Yeah,
I think that's a great project. That will actually tie into another podcast, actually.
super
But
duper.
Yogeta, thank you so much for today. It's been brilliant having you on. If anyone who's been listening would like to get in touch with Yogeta, you can find her on LinkedIn. How else is best to reach you, Yogeta, apart from LinkedIn?
LinkedIn. I've got a website, email address. Contact you. I'm sure someone can find me somewhere if they need to.
Oh, brilliant. And to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to be involved in this podcast, feel free to get in touch. You can find us either on our website at housinggeospatial.co.uk or on our LinkedIn page. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and catch you next time.
Thank you.
And that's it.
Woohoo!
Yay! And I did record.